you a note that's on my phone. Don't worry, it's not romantic poetry or anything that I've been writing. 2 years ago, I started keeping a list of notes of all the music events that I was hearing about affected by extreme weather driven by climate change. And about 8 months in, I stopped because I was getting arthritis in my thumb because I was just scrolling and scrolling. And we hear about these live events being affected by heat waves and storms and wildfires and hurricanes, but they can feel like one-offs, like individual news stories. And it was only when I'd gathered this list together that I really felt that pattern and that real sort of trend that felt very, very stark. And each year, we have a reminder that this is only going in one direction. So that's what we're here to talk about for this next little while. This is our new climate reality. And the only way that we're going to navigate this, in order to continue to have a healthy, live, cultural scene, is to work together, to share knowledge, our strategies, and our adaptations. 2024 served as a stark reminder of the escalating costs of climate change, both human and economic. With estimates of around $320 billion in damages worldwide, and only half of that insured, it's clear that we're operating in a landscape of increasing risk. So, welcome to this session, live music events in new climate, damage limitation. I appreciate the title isn't that cheery, but we have to be grounded in the reality of what's happening and work together to find pathways through this. My name is Greg. I'm a journalist and content maker, and most of my reporting brings together pop culture and climate change. I also support a global network of more than 700 journalists and editors in 122 different countries to tell more and better stories about climate change in mainstream media. It's at the Oxford Climate Journalism Network. And I'm delighted to be joined by a distinguished panel of speakers to discuss this topic here today. I'll introduce you to them quickly before we get into the discussion. Starting with Dr. Clair Barnes. Clair is a statistician and researcher based at Imperial College London. And Clair works with the globally renowned World Weather Attribution Initiative. You'll have come across their work even if that name doesn't ring a bell, because they specialize in rapid analysis of extreme weather events. So basically determining how the frequency and the intensity of an extreme weather event has been affected by climate change. So if you've ever read a news story that said something like, this extreme weather event was made X amount times more severe or likely by climate change, it's often Clair's team that have been doing that work. So welcome to you, Clair. Megan Best, I come to you next. Megan is coming at this topic from the perspective of an independent festival maker turned sustainability consultant, having witnessed extreme weather outdoor events worsen in their intensity over the past decade where you've been based in Ireland. Mm-hmm. And you've got first-hand experience of navigating this. Back in 2023, for example, the Body and Soul Festival, where you've been the operation managers for more than a decade, was hit by a severe electrical storm. We'll be hearing about that shortly. Stephen Howell from Howden Insurance Brokers. Welcome, Stephen. Your background is as a DJ and band manager and roadie, so you know this world very well. But at the same time, you've been working as an insurance broker in the music community for more than a decade, working with partners of all kinds. And you've worked on more than 13,000 policies, including working with those putting on live events in this climate and also those trying to respond to the effects of extreme weather events. And completing the panel, I've got Erik Distler. Erik is the Vice President Sustainability at AEG, responsible for overseeing AEG Sustainability, the organization's corporate sustainability program. And in your capacity, you lead the department's global strategy that addresses environmental impacts across energy, waste, and water, for a few examples. And you're based at AEG HQ in Los Angeles, which is actually where I'd like to start, because Los Angeles and extreme weather has been on many of our minds in recent months with the devastating and deadly wildfires that have happened in that region, the conditions for which were fueled by climate change. So this is where you live and where you work, Erik. You're based in Los Angeles. How has your experience been the past couple of months? What's the response been like within your personal and professional circles?
Yeah, well, thank you, Greg, and thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. You talked about grounded in reality. I think, this last few months, no better, experience of that in terms of those of us in Los Angeles. So January 7th, a lot changed. I was impacted personally, and obviously as a company, as AEG, we've been responding. So On the personal side, I live in a home that fortunately was not burned down, but was significantly damaged from smoke and fire retardant. So the fire started burning around 10 a.m. on January 7th, and at noon, our phones are going off, and I'm racing home, and we're evacuated, and still haven't been home. So, there's many others in our community that were more adversely impacted, and I think, we start to, as we sit here a few months later, starting to sort of unpack kind of what that means. I know we'll talk a bit about how we communicate and when we communicate about these issues. And I will say, as an individual experiencing it, I think often, when these extreme weather events happen, and we'll get into the discussion, obviously, in much more detail with the group here that know far more about this subject. But I think it's a reminder that these events happen to people. And first and foremost, we need to sort of hold that space, right? And so I think kind of shifting to how we responded from a sustainability department, from an AEG perspective, I will tell you, from my department, one of the first things we did is we did nothing, right? I think we need to be really careful when these events happen, not to sort of latch on our effort and our cause. There's a point in time from which we'll talk about the fact that we had fires during unseasonable time. For Los Angeles fires are usually in the fall, right? We had very high winds, dry conditions, all of that as a result of extreme weather, climate change, all the impacts I think all of us know here. But when 10,000 homes burn and people are displaced in their community, I think what you do in that moment is just show up with them and say, I'm so sorry, how can I help, right? And so AEG as an organization responded quite a bit on the onset, right? We put together all kinds of community events. We own a professional hockey team. We did a big fundraising event with the LA Kings. We supported fire aid efforts, which I know raised over $100 million to direct causes of those impacted. We host the Grammys, right? The Grammys raised over $20 million and put together a fund for employees who were displaced or lost homes. All those efforts you sort of do initially as an organization. And I think really probably over the last few weeks where we've really started to communicate and talk about within our business and externally to our employees, what are we doing as a company related to all these impacts, related to climate change and sustainability, and how are we going to be more resilient as an organization going forward?
Claire, I'd like to come to you next. World Weather Attribution did a rapid analysis of the Los Angeles wildfires. Briefly, kind of what were the findings from that, and also how likely is this to happen again in the short term in the Los Angeles and greater California region?
So, wildfire in Los Angeles is very complex, is the first thing I would start by saying. So, as you say, Erik, it's an area that is prone to wildfires. It's been described as like building in a floodplain, but for fires. So it's an area that is used to dealing with these events. And what was so shocking and so severe about the event this year was that the time of year that it happened, I think, was the main thing. So there's these Santa Ana winds that come down off the mountains and drove the fire towards Los Angeles, and that's what made it so hard to contain and what made it spread so quickly. And usually those winds peak in kind of December, January time. And by that time, usually it's rained, so that the vegetation is dampened down and it's not so flammable. And the peak of the dry season doesn't coincide with the peak of those winds. Now, sometimes those winds happen early, and that's when you get the big fires earlier in the season. This is the first time that it just didn't rain throughout October, November, December, pretty much nothing. And so it was just tinderbox conditions. And so any ignition, I'm not sure what the ignition source was, if that's been established yet.
I don't think so.
Any ignition, it's just ready to go. And that really is what caused it. And those conditions, those dry conditions, are becoming more likely in this region because of climate change. We found that there's like a 20-odd day delay in the end of that dry season, which makes it way more likely that that overlap will happen. So this is the first time that's happened, but it will not be the last. And obviously this is a really extreme example. It was worsened by the fact that the last 2 years have been quite wet in that region, so there was a lot of vegetation which then dried right down and was a huge amount of fuel just just ready to go. So that has also exacerbated it, but this kind of, it's a term that you might have heard if you read stories about it, this kind of climate whiplash, where you get very wet years or very wet events followed by very dry events. They can make these kind of events even more likely to happen. And on the flip side of that, if you have a very dry year, and in fact we saw this in Los Angeles, where it had been so dry, the ground was really hard and really kind of concrete-like, I guess. And then when it did rain, there was flash flooding. And you may have seen that in the news. I think that was covered less here at the time. But there were floods in the same area where the burn scars just filled with water because it was primed for flash flooding by the preceding dry conditions. So you get these kind of cycles, and it makes it very hard to recover from when one area gets hit by these kind of recurring events in quick succession.
And I want to acknowledge the human impacts of this first. I mean, Erik, I'm sorry to hear about your experience. And also, we know that people lost their lives. Thousands of people lost their homes, possessions, memories, culture, the communities in what's happened. And it's still in the very early days of what a recovery looks like next, right? But on the economic side, Stephen, the costs of extreme weather events like this are astronomical. Like, broadly, what effect does this sort of have on the insurance space? Because the losses of this one event are estimated to be something between $90 and $150 billion, which just, it feels like made up money, doesn't it? Like, what? How? It doesn't even seem real, that sort of level of cost. So, if you're running the Hollywood Bowl venue in Los Angeles, or a small studio, or the whole spectrum of people involved with music, what's the sort of impact of something like this on your future when it comes to sort of safeguarding it with insurance?
Well, there's a number of impacts. The main thing people worry about is will the event get cancelled? And if I'm an artist, will I get paid if it gets cancelled? If I'm the promoter, will I lose money? Do I have to refund, or have I got costs that I can't reclaim, and therefore I need to cover them? And we have insurance policies that cover all of those eventualities. The thing with the sort of extreme weather and wildfires is that most people think about it in relation to an outdoor event, because that's normally what it affects. But during the recent fires, we had artists that were performing in indoor venues in LA, which actually got cancelled because it was unsafe, because the area had to be evacuated. And I think it's the first time I've seen weather impacting indoor shows. But in terms of the artist's interests, they can claim on their insurance policy and still get paid. In terms of the promoter, they can claim on insurance policy and cover all their costs, make all their refunds. So from a sort of purely economics of the show, it's insurable and it can be covered. But then you've got other insurance risks, if you like, things like the liability risk. If people get hurt, if property gets damaged, all of those things need to be insured as well. And as I understand it, a lot of the buildings in Los Angeles had exclusions in the insurance policies for wildfire, which is, I think, where your stats come from in terms of the uninsured elements of that. And that's something that people need to be aware of, that if you can't get insurance, what can you do to mitigate losses? And that's things like having sort of fire breaks, having fire detection equipment, and firefighting equipment to make sure that you don't end up in a loss situation.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. I mean, Los Angeles is one recent and very resonant example for all of us, but it's not just about Los Angeles. This is a global trend, right? So I'm keen to just make sure that we're not focusing on kind of one place, because last year obviously was the hottest global year on record. We keep breaking records in that respect, and obviously if we keep burning fossil fuels at the rate that we are, it means that warming is not going to stabilize anytime soon. So we are in this stark reality where music culture faces extreme weather events more regularly: the heat waves, the hurricanes, the storms. And Megan, I'd like to come to you next and bring you in. You've worked on events that have been affected by extreme weather in the past. please can you tell us a little bit about those experiences, what it's been like there on the ground during the weekend when you've been putting on those events, and then perhaps after that we'll talk a little bit about how you've been forced to adapt.
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's nobody who works in outdoor events who hasn't experienced extreme weather. I bet there's a few people here who have been to a wet Glastonbury, probably, and have probably still bearing the scars. I mean, we're used to it. But what has been happening over the last decade is that they're becoming more and more common and more intense. Like the rainfall that we've been having is fairly tropical at some of our events, kind of monsoon. Like the one that I was telling you about prior to this, Greg, was in 2023, we had an electrical storm overhead at an event that we were running in Mullingar in Ireland. And what it did was we were tracking it coming across the country for a couple of hours before it happened. It might miss us. We might just get away with this one, and watching the lightning strikes as they were approaching. But what happened was when it became directly overhead, it knocked out the radio repeater for our communications, which the radio repeater for anybody who runs a festival will know this. It's the one that gives the wider range to your communications. So it tends to be your event control, your fire control, your medical, and your security. And we lost those communications channels at exactly the same time as we were clearing our arenas. Because we were clearing the arenas because of we were expecting lightning strikes onto our stages. So that was a really hairy moment, and it was one that we were, and I'll hold my hand up here now and say it, we were utterly unprepared for, because it had never happened before. It was totally unprecedented. We've done all of the scenario planning with the guards and with the emergency services, and we've done all of the fires and the floods and all of these things, but losing communications to that degree at that specific moment. So we had to adapt. We moved people onto different radio channels. We moved onto the phones. We got everybody out of the arenas safely. We lost one of our stages entirely. It was flooded up to chest height, so we had to remove all of the programming on that. But I shudder to think what it would have been like if the event had been bigger. It was only a 5,000 capacity, so it was manageable. But that site has held 20,000 people in previous years. That would have been a much harder thing to do. And these effects of all of these extreme weather events, they're tough enough for us and for the human cost and for the financial costs that we're talking about. But there's a huge nature cost as well that's what we're starting to experience and see. That same site that I'm talking about from the Body and Soul Festival was hit really hard by Storm Eowyn there last month. We lost 100 trees that we would have been very close to. I mean, we've worked that site for 15 years. You know, we know those trees and we've seen them all come down. And there's something as well in terms of the danger and the risk and the management, which goes back to what you were saying, Claire, in terms of how vegetation responds in these kind of ways to this, what's happening in terms of climate change. I mean, like my background is in forestry, so I'm kind of close to this one. But what happens if you've got a really long, dry summer is that the boughs of your trees will dry out and get really brittle. And then you get one heavy rainfall and they'll get really heavy and they'll drop. So what we've discovered is a lot of those estate owners and estate managers where we go and have our lovely week-long camping festivals are being forced to undertake quite a lot of preparatory work now, which has additional cost. You know, they're bringing in tree surgeons, they're taking out those kind of heavy boughs, they're doing a lot of that kind of trees assessments. So it's becoming more precarious in a myriad of different and complicated ways, not just the extreme weather events in and of themselves, but the complex interrelationships of everything else too.
Stephen, I wanted to ask about how this is affecting the sort of the policies that, I mean, let's assume everybody in here has a connection in some way to live music, whether you're a manager or you're involved with the production or whatever it might be. Like, what is the sort of the reality of the trend then? Like, in terms of if you're an independent festival, you know, putting on an event for 5,000 people, or if you're, you know, leading a kind of global network of indoor and live, you know, outdoor live events, like policy's becoming more expensive because these things are happening more frequently. And what would just take us inside the sort of trend of what's happening now and what you expect to happen in the next couple of years?
Well, interestingly, even though the weather patterns are getting worse and increasing in frequency, the actual insurance policies aren't getting more expensive. And I think one of the reasons for that is because organisers are getting better at understanding the sites that they work on and mitigating potential problems, because no one wants to cancel an event, and so everyone knows Glastonbury, and everyone knows Glastonbury's been underwater in times, but it's never actually cancelled because of extreme weather. And so people invest a lot of time into making sure that the event can go on. And probably the most important thing to any event is the car parks. And if you can't get people parked, you can't get people in. If you can't get people in, you haven't got an event. So a lot of work and time is invested into making sure you can get everyone parked. And there's very simple mitigation things. If you've got a farmer's field and it's got one gate, then every vehicle in that field has to go through that gate. If it's a bit wet, you only need 10 or 20 vehicles and you've got mud. So running trackway from that one gate all the way down the field and taking the cars off at different places, you mitigate the problem of a field getting unusable. And there have been examples of festivals who haven't had the experience of having problems to know to build a car park in that way that have had problems. And the other thing to point out is that we call it we call it cancellation insurance, or a lot of people do, but very rarely do. I'm talking about UK festivals here, get cancelled. What normally happens is event organisers spend more money making sure they can stay open. And one of the things about these policies is that they will pay for that money, they'll pay for those costs to keep the event open. Because the underwriters who have underwritten the whole event budget don't want it to cancel and don't want to pay it out. So if you're underwriting a few £1 million of an event budget, spending 50, 60, 100, 200,000 pounds to keep that event open is much, much better than having it cancelled. So the policies are there to protect for the worst, but actually are also there designed to support the organisers into ensuring that event can go on. And we have, us as brokers, our job is to find the right policy. We have underwriters who put the money in if something goes wrong. They have actuaries, and they're people that sit behind the scenes working out the likelihood of a claim. So these are the people that are looking at the history, they're looking at the location, they're looking at the weather patterns in that location, and trying to calculate the likelihood of a claim happening. And then we also look in detail at the event management plan, what the contingency budget is, how much trackway is on site, how much bark is on site, if it's not enough on site, how quickly can it get to site so they can actually maintain a site that's safe for people to work on. They look at the wind tolerances of all the structures on site and how much wind is needed before an event is cancelled. And interestingly, last year we had more wind cancellations or postponements or disturbances on site than wet weather, than rain. And going back sort of 10 years or so, it was always rain that stopped play. But organisers have got much better at understanding that. And what we tend to see is that people now, through people like the Association of Independent Festivals, they are coming together and sharing experiences. So people that have traded for 20 years and never had rain as an issue are working with other people that have, and getting those mitigating factors on board so that they can share best practice and keep open.
I think that's a key point, isn't it? Don't wait to be affected before you put some plans in place.
Exactly.
I want to come back to you briefly, Megan, just to take us inside that the sort of debrief that happened within your festival in light of what happened in 2023. Stephen saying, organisers are having to move to do more things to mitigate, and the actions they need to take to be insured. Have you felt that? Is that stuff that you had to do, that you've had to kind of make changes to, and how challenging has that been?
Yeah, no, definitely. Wet weather contingencies have become more and more key parts of event management plans in the last number of years, as we have been experiencing more and more of these events. But I mean, in the grand scheme of the things, as Stephen quite rightly says, wind is a huge, huge impact, particularly for outdoor events. And I suppose one way to kind of start mitigating against that is using more and more solid structures. Like we have a stage that was built again on the Body and Soul site that was built from timbers from the estate, and I should have brought some photos. It's a massive piece of infrastructure. I was showing Chris some photos of it last night, made of all of these like huge logs. It's a heavy beast of a thing. There isn't a storm in Ireland that will knock that down. Well, maybe in about a decade as things continue going the way they're going. But I think that the way to start really mitigating against this is a lot of these independent festivals and a lot of these events joining forces and putting some money behind solid assets that will actually outlast these kind of effects and these events. And we are starting to see that slowly happen. The Association of Independent Festivals is a great example of this, where we can actually share this kind of infrastructure and new business models to come out of it, because we're going to need to put more solid things in place as these climatic events are coming.
Claire, I guess to come back to you, what we're talking about here is health, right? We're talking about human health, we're talking about the more than human health, we're talking about nature and biodiversity as well. But a few examples from the past few years, we've been talking a lot here about wind and rain and wildfires, but also we've seen extreme and very intense heat waves affecting live events. There was the very sad death of a Taylor Swift fan, Anna Bafidis, in 2023 in Brazil. We saw, you might have seen the news story about the Ed Sheeran shows in the US the summer before last, where a lot of concert goers were affected by heat and had to go to hospital. For a moment, let's talk about heat as well. Like, how hot is too hot when it comes to human health and for fans and for performers? What can we expect? You mean you're working on these extreme weather events, including heat waves, all the time, looking at attribution. So what can you tell us about that?
I mean, the picture for heat and what is going to happen with heat waves under climate change is a lot clearer than it is for other hazards. I mean, the world is warming, therefore local temperatures are going to increase. How much by is really the question. So actually in Northwest Europe, we're in one of the regions outside of the Arctic that is warming most rapidly. So in response to 1.3-ish degrees of global mean temperature increase, we're seeing 2 to 4 degrees increase in kind of daily maximum temperatures and in the hottest temperatures of the year. So, I mean, if you imagine the heat wave that we had a couple of years ago where we hit 40 degrees, if you imagine that had hit on Glastonbury weekend, people would have died. And people don't realize the risks of heat. We call it the silent killer because often, you know, with floods, you can see the impacts right away. With fires, you see those people died because of those fires. With heat, it's not so clear. It just means if you've got underlying health conditions, everything is harder and you are more likely to suffer from them. So your cause of death in many areas may not even be recorded as the heat, but the heat definitely was the contributing factor, even if it's not the kind of primary cause of death. So I think it's something to really be aware of, not even with extreme heat and heat waves specifically, but just the fact that it's hotter. You know, it doesn't have to be a heat wave for it to be dangerously hot. If you've got lots of people, part of the reason that that our comms manager, when you got in touch with us, suggested that I come and do this was because he was talking about going to Glastonbury this year, and I was like, there is no shade, take hats. Because if you're not in a tent, there is nowhere to, there's like one tree, possibly not even any trees anymore, I don't know. But like the sunburn I used to get when I used to go to Glastonbury 20 years ago, and oh my God, thank God it's not now, because I would have had heat stroke, and I was a reasonably sensible teenager, 20-something. So it's something that even when you're not dealing with extreme weather, to keep people safe, you really need to be thinking the temperatures that we are going to see are just going to be more than anyone is acclimatized to and more than what we've experienced in the past. We can't rely on past experience as a guide to what's going to happen in the next 10, 20 years. And you said last year was record temperatures. Actually, we know, sorry, this is the statistician in me coming out, but I'll put it away again in a minute. The statistics show, and the science shows, that extreme record temperatures and rainfall are more likely, they increase in line with the rate of warming. So the quicker the world is warming, the more record temperatures we're going to see, the more record rainfall events we're going to see. So until we stop burning fossil fuels and we flatten that kind of temperature curve, that global temperature curve, these extremes are going to become, these record extremes are going to become more frequent. So the average temperatures are going to be higher, and you're going to need to factor that into keeping people safe, but also those peak temperatures are going to become more likely as well. Sorry.
In about 5 minutes, I'm going to come to questions. Excuse me. In about 5 minutes, I'm going to come to any questions. So if you've got something you want to ask the panel, do get ready. But Erik, I want to come to you. We've heard about the experience of festival organisers on the ground dealing with extreme weather events. We've heard about the trends, what we can expect. We've heard about the changes in insurance and how policymakers are working, or how insurers are working with live events. At AEG, I mean, I appreciate you're working on a kind of global level with a huge network of venues and events, but how is this impacting your decision-making as a business?
Yeah. I mean, I think, first and foremost, we have a lot going on in our business across our various festivals and our venues already across our sustainability efforts. And I think this conversation today has just illuminated the fact that we need to keep those efforts up. Often, the challenge sometimes, I think, in an organization is making the case to leadership for resources and allocation in order to devote more funds to doing more on the ground with cleaner fuel sources, looking at the way we're using materials and the way we're diverting waste. And so I think these conversations, I think what's happening in terms of weather patterns and climate change makes some of these conversations with our senior leaderships a bit more robust. I think one of the the areas that we're spending a lot of time, I think pertinent to this conversation that I'm spending time on lately is we've got a lot of reporting requirements that are coming in 2026, both in Europe with CSRD, which I'm sure many of you are very aware of and are working alongside. In the United States, we also have California Senate bills 253 and 261 that are requiring some of the same reporting and disclosure. So all of this is sort of connected back to this topic, because one of those key components and deliverables in this work is financial risks to our business related to climate change, right? And so financial risk can be economic risk. It could be increased insurance rates. We've had extreme weather events at a handful of our venues worldwide in the last few years. I know the O2, which is obviously part of AEG, had multi-million-dollar impact with a tear in the roof. We had a freeze event in Texas that also had a multi-million-dollar impact that affected one of our venues. These have increased our deductibles tenfold, right? And so we're seeing that price go up. So that's an economic risk related to climate change to our business. And then just starting to translate that to impacts on the balance sheet, impacts on the P&L. And those conversations are becoming more robust and increasingly because we've got these requirements coming this next year to disclose. And so as we're going to report to these agencies on impacts to our business from climate change, one, I think it just forces broader conversations in our company, talking to our CFO, talking to our general counsel, making sure folks are aware of that this is no longer nice to have, this is required. And then with that is the commitment to continue to devote resources to the on-the-ground work that we're doing in the festivals and doing in our venues. So it sort of all gets connected, right? So the efforts that we take on at VST and All Points East and Coachella and Stagecoach, those become easier cases to make for capital deployment because of, I think, some of the pressures we're seeing on the regulatory front as well.
And I don't want to frame this as a kind of, I can't think of any other word apart from opportunity, having given what we've just seen in Los Angeles. It doesn't feel right to use that word. But what you're describing is like that experience has been felt by a lot of people, that vulnerability, and maybe that can be transformed into energy that maybe opens doors to senior leadership that previously has not prioritized this. So does it feel like there's a change? Is there a change in atmosphere? Is there a change in like seriousness to this issue?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think you definitely don't want to proselytize or jump onto an issue and sort of make it about something that it's not. I mean, people are suffering, and people in Los Angeles have lost homes, and there's a huge economic impact, and it's going to take multiple years to build back. But it makes those conversations a bit more real when you sort of see and feel those impacts in your own life, in your own community. But the case for sustainability, which is, I think, what I'm doing every day, is defining why sustainability is valuable to our company and what are those levers for impact in the case. The case gets more robust when these issues happen. So, never waste a good tragedy, right, is, I think, the phrase. And, I think, what we're experiencing in the world today is really helping our sustainability department get work done in our business.
Okay, so Do we have anybody that wants to ask any questions to the panel? What we maybe do is take one or two before we get final thoughts from our panelists. Yeah, we've got a question down here. Thank you. We've got one question here and one question there. So if we take them both together, so one and then two, and then we'll have them answered. If you just want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi. So I'm Amina, representing In Place of War, and I run a creative collective called the Tube Studios, platforming what society perceives as strange. But this is more for Megan, because I'm really interested in what you said about sort of building like solid foundations in terms of staging, and for other like grassroots organizations or collectives, what would be your advice in terms of sort of supporting or like designing stages that are like more solid and sustainable for festivals? So.
Brilliant. Okay. Should we go ahead and answer that, and we can come to the next question?
Yeah, so if I understand the question, it's about that kind of grassroots and independent festivals coming together and having a look at that infrastructure. Yeah, I mean, we have some examples of it in Ireland already. We're working with one of the local authorities in Ireland, and they've started purchasing equipment for festivals specifically, some battery packs, some waste management infrastructure, and just a few of those barriers to entry for festivals to start moving towards that, embracing sustainable principles and practices at their events. And what's nice about that is it gives an opportunity for the local authority, the county council, to act as a nexus point for these festivals and to bring them together for training, for conversations, for these challenges to be explored in a shared facility. So there's opportunities for county councils or local authorities to work in this space and to kind of act as a connector and to kind of push those kind of ideas forward. It's very early stages, but it seems to be that kind of collective action, sharing of assets, sharing of staging, sharing of infrastructure is definitely a way, particularly for those smaller community-led cultural events that are happening. And I know they're really like important as part of the culture here in the UK as well, because a lot of them are really experiencing that barrier to entry in terms of making those changes, because the initial investment, and we were chatting about this earlier, in making those kind of sustainability moves can be a really difficult one to surmount, but then the payoff and the longer term return on investment can be quite good, yeah. Does that answer your question? Kind of.
Thank you for your question. In the centre there.
Hey, lots of great chat about mitigation on the ground. I'm wondering if there's any good stories, case studies about bringing this business case upwards and lobbying for legislation, pushing the voice of music into that sort of business case for governments to be actually doing something about this. We have lots of big companies with that could really showcase the need for further legislation. I'm wondering what they're doing about this, both in insurance and in music, and if we have any wins on that. And then also science question, El Niño's coming in, suddenly we're gonna see this cooling. How do we keep the message going that this is not gonna stick around?
Thank you. Perhaps Erik, come to you first. Regarding the question around like the kind of the power that music business can have and its lobbying of government to do things. I mean, you're based in the Californian context, which I know is like fairly progressive, but you're working on in a global context as well. So be good to hear your thoughts on that. Yeah.
I mean, we work, so we do this collectively. So this is an area where, with our counterparts and colleagues at Live Nation, a big competitor of ours and other large organizations, where we sort of have these conversations together, certainly at the state level as much as we can at our U.S. federal level, which can be challenging just the way we're structured in our country, certainly today. But I think what's promising, and a lot of the work we spend time on, is in California. And what I think assuring about the two California Senate bills that we're applicable to is that virtually every company that does business probably does business in some level, large business in California, and meets those revenue thresholds. So in effect, it becomes almost federal law. So our effort is how do we keep moving that regulatory line to be tighter and tighter. So often regulation is a great way to get people to act, but it's usually not the best way to innovate, because if the line you have to be under is here, an organization is just going to get right under the line. So it's a way to sort of start the conversation, but we're trying to make that case. How is it important to our business? What are our fans and our patrons and some of our partners responsible for? So, but the policy and the legislation side of it is certainly conversations that we have.
Thank you. And just to add some kind of personal thoughts, I've spent the last couple of months reporting on what's been happening in Los Angeles, the stories coming out of the music community. One thing I've been really struck by, which I'm not going to put on any of the panelists to talk about here, is the sort of absence of the talk about climate change and the attribution to what actually happened. We saw like the big Fire Aid concerts, the globally streamed concerts, and things like the Grammys, and the words climate change weren't really mentioned at all within those contexts. I'm not going to put that on any of the panels to kind of answer that. I don't think that's necessarily fair, but it was an observation of my own that I thought was quite interesting. Claire, to come to you regarding the question around the kind of expected global weather patterns for this year, and whether that affects the sort of prioritization, if you like, of the message that we're trying to get out about climate change.
I mean, I could share some thoughts on why climate change hasn't been mentioned in the Los Angeles fires, but we've only got 3.5 minutes, so maybe we can talk about that afterwards.
There's one word.
Yeah, there's one word that explains that, I think. I love that I got a La Nina question. I love this. Yeah, so for those of you that don't know, El Nino and La Nina, there's this big, it's kind of a patch of ocean in the tropics that the gradient of the temperature across that ocean really affects weather in lots of parts of the world. It's very weird. When I learned about it as a statistician, I was like, that's like magic, that doesn't make sense. It's called a teleconnection. It kind of affects things that are very far away for reasons that aren't always immediately obvious. It doesn't actually have much effect on the weather in the UK and in Northern Europe. So actually, in terms of what you guys need to worry about, probably not so much, depending on where you work. But it does affect the global temperatures. And you're right, in a La Nina year, which is what we've just been officially declared as being, I think, in mid-January, you would expect the global mean temperature to be a bit lower than in an El Nino year, which is what we've had the last couple of years. And 2023, 2024, record global mean temperatures, they were El Nino years, and everyone went, oh, it's because it's El Nino. It'll get cooler when it's a La Nina year, and it really hasn't by that much. So January was the hottest January on record. February is currently on track to be one of the hottest Februarys on record, certainly the hottest La Nina February on record. So most of the communication I've been seeing about this in the science community is, oh, we don't really know why this is happening at the moment. Have we reached a tipping point? We don't know. So I don't think that's going to shut down the conversation about climate change at all. If anything, it's just going to enhance it, the fact that we've had 2023, 2024, 2025 should be down here, and it's like, we're way above where we would expect to be in a La Nina year. So yeah, I don't think that's going to stop that discussion at all, and we will keep yelling about it anyway, even if it does.
Yeah. I think there was maybe one or two more questions there, but we've got two. We've got 1 minute left, so apologies. In fact, is everybody going to be able to stick around? If you do want to come and chat to the panelists, I imagine folks are going to be able to stick around even just for a few minutes if you do want to speak to us afterwards. But yeah, with less than a minute to go, we should probably wrap up. But I want to extend my thanks to Claire, to Stephen, to Erik, and to Megan. Thanks for your contribution and your thoughts on all that. I thought it was really, really interesting. So please join me in thanking my panelists. And